So what I'll do to do that is give you a little bit of the history of the discussions that we've been having within our department in the various reviews we've had of riparian policy over the years. I've been with the Alberta government for 10 years now, and this is now our second review. The first one was, it's basically was stalled because of the mountain pine beetle epidemic, and we've kind of reinitiated our review recently. So I think an understanding of some of the discussions we've had in the past will help inform some of the discussions we have today. All right, so the outline of my talk will be to first look at what our riparian management policy is in Alberta to begin with. And then we'll talk about the review we did back that was finished in 2005. It went from around 2003 to 2005. And some of the outcomes that came from that. And Axel already alluded to the functions and goals of riparian management, and that came out at that time. Then after that, we started working on some of the recommendations that came out of that review, and I'll talk about the progress since 2005. And then we reinitiated this review process a few years ago, and I'll talk about what we're trying to do now in the current review. And in those discussions, we're talking about the challenges with our current policy, and I'll discuss that a little bit. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts, which are more personal to me, but can maybe inform some of our discussions. All right. When we talk about policy, when we're talking about riparian policy, it's probably a good idea to talk about what is good policy. So within the Alberta government, we often talk about that there's three cogs to what make good natural resource management policy. Most of our policies, the objective is to enhance stewardship of the landscape. We're trying to maintain some value on the landscape. And so, of course, that's a central cog. We're trying to be good stewards. But if we do not consider these other two cogs, industry competitiveness or the government of Alberta efficiency in delivering those policies, that policy of delivering stewardship will not be successful. So, and in my experience, when we've had discussions on various policies and where we have disagreements on policies, it's because often we're elevating one particular element of these three cogs above the other ones, or we're disengaging it from the other ones. So we're maybe focusing all our attention on, efficiency of delivering a policy from a government perspective without thinking about the stewardship values. Or we're thinking about economic competitiveness without thinking about how much it might cost to deliver from the Alberta government perspective. So all these three cogs need to be connected to deliver good policy. All right, talking about riparian management in Alberta. Riparian management is actually guided by a whole series of different laws and regulations, and they're all geared to the different sectors in the economy, and each one is specific to a different land use or activity on the landscape. And that's just because of how policies have evolved through time. We tend to manage not the environment, which of course is a single entity. We're managing people, and we're managing all the different activities we do. So that's why you see such a series of different acts and pieces of legislation there. So a sample here is, if you look at the water sector, we have the Water Act. In the white zone, which is the settled agriculture zone in the province, we have the Municipal Government Act, which enables municipalities to create riparian management or water management policies in their areas. With the forestry sector, of course, we have the Forest Act, which has under which is the timber management regulation, which enables the creation of operating ground rules. And we'll be talking about that more extensively through the day, because that's why we're here today. In the oil and gas sector, we have the new approval standards under the enhanced approval process. And those enhanced approval process standards have been largely informed by our operating ground rules. So there's, and we won't be talking about it so much today, but one point I want to make here, though, is that riparian management, of course, riparian areas don't, they move through all these different sectors. So in the long run, we'll want to ensure that all these different policies do effectively integrate with each other. So, of course, we're focused on forestry today, but it is our hope especially now that we're integrating as a department and as a government, that what we're doing here in the forestry sector will influence what's going on in the other sectors of our department and within government, and that more integrated riparian management policy will be the result. Okay, let's talk about the operating ground rules. And I'll just give a little brief overview of what they are in case you're not quite familiar with them. There's it's actually a very simple system. It basically takes, it starts off just classifying the water courses, and then based on the classification, it specifies certain operating rules on those areas, such as water course protection areas, setbacks for roads, and operating conditions. Now, in terms of the classification side, the criteria that's used for classification is channel width. And now what I've shown here on the screen here is simply just a subset of the entire operating ground rules. There's also special rules for lakes and other water bodies as well, but I focused here on flowing water. Now, there is flexibility built into this rather prescriptive system, and there's two key areas of flexibility. The first one is that companies have the option of adopting these provincial ground rules, or they have the option of creating their own ground rules. And when they do that, that's usually done in negotiation with government, and then they have to be approved by government in the end. But there's flexibility in being able to vary from these ground rules. And the second area of flexibility is that at the operational level, companies can actually apply for a variance from these. So if there's a specific reason to differ from this, they can apply to vary from it. And the rationale for the variance needs to be related to aquatic and terrestrial habitat objectives. Okay, one thing that I'd like to comment on here when we're talking about these operating ground rules is it's rather interesting that this policy is one of the few policies, maybe the only policy that relates to forest management in which a quantitative requirement has been set in terms of leaving merchantable trees behind that otherwise could be harvested. All our other policies that relate to forest management, if you think about landscape level strategies such as old growth retention, or stand level strategies such as structure retention, there's no specific target set there. Those targets are part of forest management planning and the planning process, and are negotiated between industry and government and approved at that time. This riparian management policy actually is one of the few places where we actually put in numbers, where we actually say this is how far you will stay away from a particular feature, and you'll leave the trees there. And that has made it very contentious for many people, because in terms of adjusting these policies, because it seems to stand out. It's the one prescriptive rule that we have. All right. Looking at the operating ground rules, the context for why we keep looking at these operating ground rules is that there are a number of policy advantages to it, but there are also some challenges with this policy. Now, with any regulation, when you set a clear number, it's rather clear, an advantage of that is clear and relatively unambiguous. It's also not subjective. Theoretically, any person looking at the rule should be able to come up with the same on-the-ground management. And because this rule is based on field measurements, it's not dependent on inventory or planning processes. We don't need to have a large data set that's created to be able to deliver this. But there are definite policy disadvantages to this. It's perceived by many as being quite arbitrary. We've set 30-meter buffers, 60-meter buffers around water bodies. Some perceive it as having a poor science basis, though I may comment on that later. And it's, as with any regulation that is set not based on local conditions, it's insensitive to local conditions. If you have a stream of a particular width, you're setting a 30-meter or 60-meter buffer on it. So, and another aspect, when I talked about the flexibility within the policy, that has been perceived, some people have perceived that as being challenging, in that there may be inconsistency in how the policy is delivered across the province. So that's been an issue that came up. So these questions have been around for years and led to about 2003, a Riparian Management Committee being established. There had been previous Riparian Management Committees before my time, and I wasn't around at that time, so I can't speak to them. But, and a lot of good work actually came out of them, which I'll speak to in a little bit. So the review in 2003 had the following objectives. One was to establish goals for riparian management. Oops, I'll leave it there. The idea is, how can you manage for something if you don't know what you're actually trying to achieve on the landscape? So, so what are we actually trying to do in riparian management? The second was to obviously describe what our current policy is and how it's being implemented. To look at how consistent we are, because that was one of the issues that was coming up. Is the policy successful at addressing those sustainable resource development goals that we had established, that it was established in goal in objective number 1 there, and then also to provide direction for future revisions of riparian management policy, and then finally to identify knowledge gaps. So this was a pretty big task that we had set for ourselves, and the first objective I think we were rather successful at, and this is what Axel referred to earlier. A fair bit of work had happened before our committee established in 2003, and for whatever reason those committees never finished their work. But one thing they did do was make a very clear, come up with some work on what riparian area functions are on the landscape. And so there's a list of 7 that we finally agreed to, and they range from abiotic objectives to biotic objectives. So trapping and storing sediment, building and maintaining banks and shorelines, reducing and dissipating energy, minimizing changes in stream water and stream temperature, or stream water chemistry, regulating water temperature, and then moving into the more overtly biotic ones, providing habitat for aquatic organisms and terrestrial organisms. Now this list of functions is significant because it includes terrestrial organisms, and there has been, at that time there was a fair bit of debate about talking about that, and we've had debate about that since as well. We all recognize that riparian areas are very important for terrestrial organisms, but the debate has been, should riparian management policy have that as a particular goal, or should we have other policies that focus on terrestrial organisms? So if this is the functions that riparian areas deliver, what are the goals that we have for how we manage them? And these goals are very, very closely linked to these riparian area functions. So this, so these 11 goals, I'm not going to read them all, link strongly to those 7 functions. And if you look under the biotic ones, you'll see that there are several goals related to terrestrial biodiversity again. Maintaining terrestrial habitat for wildlife, landscape connectivity is in there, maintaining characteristic microclimates, vegetation communities. That's dealing with some of these unique old growth habitats that occur in riparian areas. And then the whole issue of cumulative effects comes in here. So the articulation of these functions and goals was seen as a pretty strong outcome of that 2005 review that happened. Okay, this another goal that we had in this review was to look at policy implementation and how consistent it was. So we looked at the local operating ground rules, and most of the companies in Alberta at that time had adopted the provincial ground rules. Only a few companies had varied from it, and they did not vary substantively from it. I think we had one company, Sundance at the time, which had come up with a variable width buffer approach, which was interesting to look at. And then the use of variances, and there we actually pulled all the senior foresters around the province and looked at how variances were being issued and what the rationale for those variances were. And that came up with some interesting results, and I won't get into that right now, but it did vary across the province. Okay, now looking at how successful was the current fixed width buffer approach in addressing those functions and goals that we talked about earlier. This was done in a more expert panel kind of approach in terms of using our professional judgment and talking with a lot of our area people. Generally, the end conclusion was that it successfully addressed the abiotic goals, and the policy was partially successful with the biotic goals. And the success with the biotic goals was more strongly linked to where we had some form of treed buffers left alongside watercourses. And some gaps were identified where we felt that maybe there was not enough management occurring to address some of the biotic goals. 3 main issues were identified that we wanted to focus in more. The designation of fixed with buffers on permanent streams and lakes, which of course is the big one all the time. The lack of buffers on intermittent streams, and the provision for variances allowing for buffer harvesting. And that dealt with that, our survey that showed that there was quite variable implementation in terms of how we were issuing variances across the province. So when we look at the issue of fixed with buffers, we focused on what kind of alternatives could we do to fixed with buffers if we're going to provide recommendations. And one thing that industry has often been asking for, and we've often heard from academia as well, is we know that riparian areas are highly dynamic systems, and yet we've created a policy environment where we're using a regulatory fixed with approach. Can't we come up with something more flexible, more sensitive to local site conditions, that's objective-based, results-based, and can't we, there's been a lot of work that's gone on with the natural disturbance model of how ecosystems function, where disturbance is an important part. Can't that inform how we do our policy development? So, so we looked at that and had extensive discussions regarding that. The issues that came up in our discussions was, if we're going to move away from something which is more regulatory, we need to actually have more information so that good decisions can be made at the site level. We need to know, obviously, site level values. We also need to know how those site level values are nested within landscape level, so we need to have an understanding of landscape level values. One criticism has always been, we're creating something rather unnatural across the landscape when we create fixed with buffers. So is that actually true? Are we creating unnatural ecosystems across the landscape? And if they are unnatural, for example, long linear strips of old forests, are there negative ecological impacts of creating that? Looking at the natural disturbance model, if we were to implement that, does it address all riparian values that we discussed under our functions and goals? If we were to use natural disturbance as the primary filter to drive our management policy. And then if we move to a more flexible results-based system, what does that actually mean for monitoring? And what does that actually mean for enforcement? How do we monitor for success under a system like that? And how do we come up with an effective enforcement system so that that we do create a level playing field among different operators? So then we came to our recommendations, and I'm skipping through a whole lot of discussions that we had through that time. When it came to looking at the fixed with buffer approach, and were we able to move beyond a regulatory system to a more flexible results-based system? When we considered all the different things that that we would need to move away from a regulatory system at the time, we would need to have those landscape level values. We needed to have a lot of, and we also need to have it mapped. We'd also need to have a strong understanding of site level values. And we also needed to have a monitoring system in place that would allow us to measure success. And then if we assess that against that, those 3 cogs that I talked about before, efficiency of delivering it from a government perspective, industry competitiveness, we came to the conclusion that we were not ready yet to move away from a regulatory-based approach. So we recommended that we maintain the fixed with buffer policy at that time, but reassess after current research initiatives were completed, and I'll talk about what those research initiatives were. Really what it came to at that time was we were concerned about increasing cost to industry in terms of the cost of doing a lot of upfront planning, The whole issue of professional accountability was important at the time as well. BC, a number of years before we did our review, had also gone to a whole approach. They wanted to move away from the Forest Practices Code to a more results-based code. And part of that was moving to results-based riparian management. And a lot of work went into creating this new results-based code, but in the end, discussions with industry resulted in the riparian aspect going back to a more rules-based approach. There were concerns about the cost to industry, also professional accountability of local foresters making decisions on sites and then being accountable for damage to riparian areas. So at that time, we ended up coming to the conclusion that at that time we didn't have everything in place yet to move away to a more flexible results-based system. We made recommendations on providing for buffers on intermittent streams, and we made a recommendation that in terms of this variance issue that we provide better criteria to both industry and government on where variance applications could be applied for. And then we came up with a list of research priorities. And one of them was to look into developing a decision support framework. So if we're going to move away from a single set of width-based buffer requirements, can we come up with a decision support framework that allows us to be much more flexible and site sensitive? What is the riparian area contribution to landscape biodiversity? So how do we fit our riparian policy into the larger landscape policy? The ecological impacts of not harvesting riparian areas, that was one of the questions that we dealt with, and so we wanted to see research happening in that area. And then finally, the cumulative effects of human activities and how that affects riparian areas. So what we did is this was written up in a report. The functions and goals part was an appendix to the report, and this was provided to our resource directors. And so the resource directors sent this as a discussion paper to industry, and the idea was to generate discussion in Alberta about the kind of issues and questions we had raised, why we didn't think we were ready to move, and what kind of research needed to happen. The second thing that happened is that that issue about creating some buffers on those transitional streams, that actually did happen. And so a new transitional class was added to the operating ground rules. And then we started doing targeted investments into recommended areas of research. So this decision support framework, we were at that time part of a Sustainable Forest Management Network, and we supported Paul Sibley at the University of Guelph, who was developing a decision support framework he was first thinking of just doing it within Ontario, but he ended up expanding his research to a broader audience when when we expressed our interest. Rich McCleary at FRI and also with his PhD work at UBC, he was focused on woody material and sediment budget research, and I think you may be talking about that a little bit later, but that was very interesting from us because that would provide an objective basis of where do we need to leave trees on a landscape and where do we need where can we be a little bit more flexible, because the values may change in terms of where woody material needs to come from within a watershed and where sediment comes from within a watershed. Another area that we started investing in at the time, and that was also related to the Sustainable Forest Management Network, was the whole idea of wet areas mapping. And Barry White will be talking about that a little bit later. And Paul Arp at the University of New Brunswick was developing that at the time, and we at that time were seeing some strong promise from Irving's experience with wet areas mapping. And then the LiDAR, I have included it there, but LiDAR wasn't really on the radar screen right in 2005 yet, so that came later. And we started to address some of the other recommendations that we had in our report, and then mountain pine beetle came. And given the size of our branch and the limited number of people we have, that just distracted us entirely. We actually made a conscious decision just to kind of put the riparian community on ice, and most of us ended up working in other areas and focusing on the mountain pine beetle issue. And so for a number of years, we were entirely focused on mountain pine beetle, and riparian management wasn't really on our radar screen for a while. So that was kind of a hiatus in progress on looking at these recommendations. All right, so in 2011, although mountain pine beetle came, the issue of riparian management never went away. And several of the companies in Alberta maintained interest in mountain pine beetle and kept asking questions. And as a result of some of those questions, the resource directors in 2011 asked us to reinitiate this riparian management committee and actually gave us some very specific questions they wanted us to look at. So they gave us a mandate letter, and the mandate letter had three main points in it. One was to assess the potential for distinct riparian management strategies in the foothills and the boreal. And this was some of the discussions that they had. And it was, I don't think they were meaning to be prescriptive to us as a committee, but they were just wanting us to consider, do we need to have a single system, or can we recognize that ecosystems changed around the province? And this particular point has significance for why we're having this workshop today, and I'll discuss that a little bit more in a minute. Review the effectiveness of fixed-width buffers and assess alternative strategies. So this whole issue of having fixed-width buffers has always been a big issue. And then finally, to assess implementation of new knowledge and technology in riparian management. And the idea about, we've been investing a lot in wet areas mapping and into LiDAR, and so, is there something that this can add to riparian management policy? So looking at this mandate letter, we as a committee reinterpreted that into 6 different key initiatives that we would need to do to address this mandate. The first one was to look at a state of knowledge. What's actually changed since our 2005 report, and also assess this whole natural disturbance paradigm, because this paradigm is a significant paradigm in forest management. It certainly suggests strongly that systems are highly dynamic, and how does that interact with with how we do riparian management. The second key initiative was to take the functions and goals that we had articulated in our 2005 report and update them and see if we can actually make this sort of more of a Government of Alberta-wide riparian management strategy. The third one is watercourse inventory and classification. So, can we move away from having a width-based system, and can we come up with a different system that might allow for a more dynamic kind of policy? And then the other ones, number 4 is the assessment of dominant hydrological processes and their potential to be the basis for separate strategies in different regions. That was addressing that question that the resource directors asked about. Maybe we can come up with separate policies for the foothills and other policies for the or separate strategies for the foothills and the boreal. And this question is really what why we wanted to see this discussion happen at this workshop. This workshop will hopefully address, the riparian processes that are going on, and how can we link riparian management policies to an understanding of riparian processes. And if we have an understanding of what the dominant processes are in different areas of the province, should we therefore not have different kinds of policies or strategies in those different areas driven by the kind of dominant processes that are driving those different riparian areas? And then finally, we had and we haven't got to these last 2 yet, knowledge gaps, research priorities, how do we deal with monitoring, and finally, creating an adaptive management framework so that we have a continuous improvement built into our riparian management policy, but we're not that far yet. When we look at the watercourse inventory and classification, that we have a subgroup working on that area right now, and that's actually a very significant issue because that directly deals with the information we have that could potentially allow us to move away from a more fixed width approach. So I'll just go through this very quickly. The challenges with the current policy we have here is that the current width-based mechanism in watercourse classification has many issues. It's not as easy to implement in the field as you may think. Buffer measurements, especially when you have a meandering stream, different people can come up with different buffer sizes. And our hydrography layer is very incomplete. Right now channel width is the only consideration. and it doesn't allow for flexibility. So can we consider other criteria, you know, substrate flow, gradient or channel, presence of fish? Buffer layout is challenging. As I mentioned, the inaccurate hydrography layer is an issue. But we do have some opportunities that some of the speakers will be talking about in a few minutes. We have LiDAR, which can provide maybe a much better hydrography layer for us in the future. We have wet areas mapping, which Barry White will be speaking to as well, which may be able to provide a basis for mapping riparian areas themselves. And just before I finish my talk, I'd like to just acknowledge that there's some other initiatives going on in the province right now. We have the Alberta Water Council, which has been working on the Riparian Land Conservation and Management Project. And what they're trying to do is define, provide a definition for riparian lands, document the current state of riparian lands and their management, and evaluate our current policy and see if it can be improved so that it better meets provincial objectives. And later on, Rick Bonner is going to be talking about, I'm assuming, about the process that they're working on at Hinton Wood Products. And so they're developing alternate ground rules for their company. And it's actually a very interesting process, and many people on our riparian committee have been interacting with their company, and we're learning from each other. And so that's a separate process going on, and that's working under the existing provision where companies can set their own alternate ground rules. And so my concluding thoughts are, and I'll just go through these quickly, riparian policy and strategies need to be embedded within the watershed and landscape context. And this has come up time and time again in our previous committee's work and now. We've, because of history, we've separated riparian management as a separate policy dealing with one particular part of the ecosystem. But it is actually part of a much larger part of the ecosystem. And until we have some way of nesting our riparian management policy within a larger landscape context in terms of, you know, what are we leaving on the broader landscape and how can riparian areas contribute to those broader values, I don't think we'll ever really come up with a riparian management policy that is truly satisfying. We need a stronger link between strategic, like our forest management plans, and the operational implementation. Right now, what companies show in their forest management plans, they're not able to, they map out riparian areas, but their net downs for riparian area management is not really what ends up happening on the ground, because we don't have good inventories that allow us to make this strong link. We have the opportunities to use these new data sets, LiDAR and wet areas mapping, and how, when we have these new data sets have changed things dramatically. The whole existence of GIS, of course, wasn't around when the old rules were developed. So given that we have these new tools, surely we can come up with the new policies that allow us to be more flexible and dynamic. And finally, any adjustment of buffer strategies can't ignore the importance of terrestrial biodiversity as a riparian function. And that comes up time and time again. I think we've often come to consensus on how to manage for aquatic values. It's when we start dealing with the terrestrial values that things become challenging. And so we need to address this terrestrial biodiversity issue head on if we're going to come up with good riparian management policy. Thank you very much.